It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked away in the corner of the kitchen counter amidst the usual chaos of bills and junk mail, a sleek, expensive-looking envelope that felt heavy with the promise of escape. He wasn't home. He was always late on Tuesdays, something about a client dinner that stretched endlessly into the evening. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the embossed logo of a luxury travel agency I knew he favored. It wasn't addressed to either of us directly, just occupant, a common enough practice for glossy advertisements, but this felt different. Thicker. More personal. I opened it, expecting a brochure for a weekend getaway, maybe a hint of a surprise he was planning for our anniversary, which was just a few months off. What tumbled out wasn't a brochure, but a crisp, printed itinerary complete with flight details, hotel confirmations, and a list of pre-booked excursions. 2 weeks in the south of France. A villa with a view of the Mediterranean. Private wine tours. Michelin star reservations. It was breathtaking, the kind of trip you dream about but rarely take. My heart did a strange little flutter, a confused mix of delight and suspicion. Suspicion won, because as I scanned the document, my eyes landed on the names printed next to passengers and guests. Not ours. His name was there, unmistakable in bold type. But the second name, the name that occupied the other half of the luxurious booking, stopped the air in my lungs. It was hers. The name I hadn't spoken aloud in years, the ghost that had haunted the periphery of our marriage like a persistent, unwelcome mist. The name of his ex-wife. The paper shook in my hand, the glossy finish suddenly feeling cold and alien. It wasn't just a flight or a hotel. It was a complete, meticulously planned experience, dripping with romance and exclusivity. Every detail screamed couples retreat. The double occupancy room, the 2 seats for the private cooking class, the reservation under 2 names at that tiny, impossible-to-get-into restaurant he'd mentioned wanting to try with me one day. The world outside the kitchen window, so ordinary just moments before, seemed to tilt slightly off its axis. How long had he been planning this? How had he kept it a secret? More importantly, why? Why would he book a romantic getaway, a fantasy vacation, for himself and the woman he'd divorced over a decade ago? My mind scrambled for explanations. Any explanation that wasn't the obvious, brutal truth. Maybe it was a business trip? No, the itinerary was pure leisure. Maybe a group tour, and she happened to be on it? Unlikely, given the private villa and personalized excursions. Maybe it was an old booking he forgot to cancel? The dates were for next month, current and confirmed. The truth, cold and sharp, settled in my gut. He was going away with her. Not a quick trip, but 2 weeks. 2 weeks of sun, wine, gourmet food, and the kind of intimate setting we hadn't shared in years. I remember the kitchen lights suddenly seemed too bright, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air, the chipped paint on the cabinet he'd promised to fix. Small, insignificant details suddenly felt monumental, symbols of everything left undone, everything overlooked. The house, this house we'd built a life in, where we'd raised children, where I'd poured every ounce of my energy and love, suddenly felt hollow. It was just a shell, and I was the unsuspecting occupant, while the architect of our shared future was planning his escape with someone else. The initial shock began to ebb, replaced by a slow, simmering wave of heat that rose from my core. It wasn't just hurt, it was a profound, consuming anger. Not the explosive kind, but a cold, calculated fury that settled deep within my bones. It was the culmination of years of small betrayals, of feeling second best, of putting his needs, his comfort, his past, before my own. This wasn't the first time she'd intruded on our lives, not directly perhaps, but her shadow had always lingered. Phone calls he took in hushed tones, necessary interactions about their adult children that seemed to stretch into long, private conversations, a lingering loyalty that I'd always tried to understand, to be the bigger person about. But this was brazen. This was a planned, deliberate act of discarding me, of seeking intimacy and joy with another woman, the woman who had been his past, while I was ostensibly his present and future. I sat at the kitchen table, the itinerary spread out before me like a map, to my husband's infidelity. I read it again, slowly this time, absorbing every detail. The flight numbers, the names of the hotels, the dates. Next month. Just weeks away. He had been living alongside me, sharing meals, sleeping in the same bed, all while planning this secret rendezvous. The hypocrisy was staggering. He'd complained about the cost of replacing the aging dishwasher last week, citing tight budgets, yet here he was, dropping a small fortune on a lavish trip for his ex-wife. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh, a harsh, dry sound that caught in my throat. All those years of being the supportive wife, the understanding stepmother, the one who held everything together while he navigated the complexities of his blended family. All for this. To be replaced, for 2 weeks at least, by the woman he'd left. Or had he ever truly left her? That question, unspoken for so long, now screamed in my mind. Had I just been filling a space, warming a bed, managing a household, while his heart, or at least a significant part of it, remained tethered to his past? The silence of the house pressed in on me. It was the quiet hour before dusk, when the light outside softens and shadows begin to lengthen. Usually, this was a peaceful time, a moment to transition from the day's tasks to the evening's calm. Tonight, it felt oppressive, the silence amplifying the turmoil inside me. I thought about the dinner he was supposedly at. Was he sitting across a table from her right now, perhaps discussing the upcoming trip? Or was this a clandestine affair, a secret he was keeping from everyone? The latter seemed more likely, given the effort taken to make the booking inconspicuous. He wasn't careless, he was calculating. That realization hurt more than the thought of him with her. It was the deliberate deception, the cold planning, the sheer audacity of it all. He had looked me in the eye, kissed me goodbye in the morning, knowing this was in the works. Every shared meal, every casual conversation, every moment of apparent normalcy was a lie. The foundation of our life, I now saw, wasn't built on solid ground, but on a fragile layer of pretense, and the wind was finally blowing it away. I picked up the itinerary again, my fingers tracing the lines of text. South of France. The very words conjured images of romance, sunshine, freedom. Everything I felt denied. I looked around the kitchen, at the familiar cabinets, the worn countertops, the view of the backyard I'd spent years cultivating. This was my reality. His was apparently somewhere else entirely. And then, a thought, slow and deliberate, began to form in my mind. A small, defiant spark in the vast emptiness left by the betrayal. He had packed his bags, in a sense, by booking this trip. He had mentally checked out, already halfway across the Atlantic with his past. Well, two could play that game. If he wanted to leave, truly leave, I wouldn't stop him. In fact, I would facilitate it. The anger, no longer just simmering, began to crystallize into purpose. A cold, clear purpose. He wanted a trip with his ex? He would get his trip. But not in the way he envisioned. He wanted to leave me behind? I would make sure he left everything behind. The house, the life, the comfortable routine he clearly took for granted. The feeling wasn't vindictive, not purely. It was a surge of self-preservation, a fierce need to protect the tattered remnants of my dignity. My hands were steady now as I refolded the itinerary, tucking it back into its envelope. I placed it carefully on the counter, no longer just evidence of betrayal, but the blueprint for my response. The silence in the house no longer felt oppressive. It felt like an opportunity, an empty canvas onto which I could paint a new reality. The first step, the one that came unbidden but felt absolutely right, was simple. I would pack his bags for him. Not just for the trip to France, but for a much longer journey. A journey out of my life. The thought brought a strange sense of calm, a quiet power settling over me. For years, I had reacted, adjusted, accommodated. Now I would act. I would be the one to orchestrate the next move. He would arrive home, full of excuses or feigned ignorance, and walk into a situation he hadn't anticipated. The script he thought he was writing for our future was about to be rewritten, drastically and irrevocably, by me. The betrayed wife, the quiet presence, was about to become the author of her own dramatic conclusion to this chapter. The south of France itinerary wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The beginning of his departure, and my reclaiming of everything he had tried to diminish. He came home later than usual, the familiar scrape of his key in the lock sounding alien in the charged silence of the house. I was sitting in the living room, the itinerary envelope resting on the coffee table, a silent accusation waiting to be acknowledged. He walked in, loosening his tie, his face a mask of practiced weariness. "Rough day," he mumbled, heading towards the kitchen. He didn't see the envelope at first. He poured himself a drink, the clinking of ice unnervingly loud. I watched him from the doorway, my presence a quiet question he couldn't ignore forever. He turned finally and our eyes met. The usual easygoing expression faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Surprise? Defiance? "Oh, hey," he said, trying for casual. "Didn't hear you. Long day?" I didn't respond immediately. I just looked at him, really looked at him. The man I had shared my life with, who had just proven how little of it he truly shared with me. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. His gaze drifted from my face to the coffee table and landed on the envelope. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. And then he knew. The color drained from his face. He didn't reach for the envelope, didn't try to snatch it away. He just stared at it, then back at me, his feigned weariness replaced by a sudden, stark panic. "What's that?" he asked, his voice tight. I didn't answer the question. He already knew. Instead, I spoke, my voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. "South of France," I said, my gaze unwavering. "Looks beautiful this time of year, especially with a villa and private tours." He swallowed hard. It's complicated," he stammered, the practiced charm vanishing completely. Complicated. That was always his go-to word when he wanted to avoid taking responsibility, to muddy the waters and make me feel unreasonable for expecting clarity and honesty. I almost laughed again, the same dry, bitter sound from earlier. "Complicated?" I echoed softly. "It looks quite simple to me. A booking. 2 passengers. You. And her." I used her name, the name that felt like acid on my tongue. His face contorted, a mixture of shame and something else I couldn't quite decipher. Anger? Resentment? "It's not what you think," he blurted out, stepping away from the counter, as if physically distancing himself from the evidence. "And what exactly do I think?" I challenged, my voice still quiet, but with a steel edge he rarely heard. "Do I think you booked a romantic getaway for yourself and your ex-wife behind my back? Because that's exactly what this itinerary says you did." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture. It's for the kids," he said, clutching at a straw so thin it was transparent. "A legacy thing. We're scouting locations for a potential family investment." My eyes narrowed. 2 people? A private villa? Michelin restaurants? That's a family investment scouting trip? Are you truly standing there and expecting me to believe that? The sheer absurdity of the lie was almost insulting. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the contempt implicit in thinking I would fall for such a transparent fabrication. Years of minimizing my intelligence, my intuition, culminated in this pathetic attempt at gaslighting. And in that moment, the last vestiges of doubt, of hoping there was some innocent explanation, evaporated. "Fine," he said, his tone shifting from desperate denial to a petulant aggression. "It's not for the kids. It's a necessary trip. Business. Kind of. There are contacts that we both need to meet with. It's professional." Professional. 2 weeks in a villa with private excursions was professional? The lie grew bolder, more insulting. So professional that it requires booking under personal names and listing you both as guests on a romantic itinerary? I countered, my voice rising slightly despite my attempt at calm. He clenched his jaw. "There were reasons," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. "Reasons you couldn't share with your wife?" I pressed. "Reasons that necessitated this level of secrecy and deception?" The silence returned, heavier than before, filled with all the unspoken words, the years of neglect, the feeling of being an afterthought in my own marriage. He couldn't defend himself against the truth laid bare. He simply stood there, exposed. And that's when I said it, the words emerging not from anger anymore, but from a place of quiet resolve that surprised even me. You know, I began, walking slowly towards a coffee table, my hand reaching for the envelope. When I saw this, my first thought was disbelief. How could he? My second was pain. The hurt cuts deep. But then came clarity. I picked up the itinerary, not looking at him, but at the elegant script on the cover. You've been planning your departure for a while, haven't you? Not just this trip. This is just the physical manifestation of a separation that's already happened in your mind. I finally looked at him, meeting his gaze with a steady, unblinking stare. Well, I said, holding up the itinerary, consider this your ticket. Your wish has been granted. His eyes darted between the envelope and my face, confusion mixing with the lingering panic. What are you talking about? He asked, though his voice lacked conviction. I'm talking about packing your bags, I stated simply, the phrase feeling incredibly powerful as I spoke it aloud. You've booked your exit. I'm just going to help you with the logistics. He stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. Pack my bags, he repeated, bewildered. For the trip? We can talk about the trip, explain things. Not for the trip. I interrupted, my voice firm. For good. For leaving. You want to go to France with her? Fine. But you're not coming back here. The words hung in the air, monumental and irreversible. The silence that followed was absolute. He didn't sputter, didn't argue, not immediately. He just stared, the carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for years crumbling before my eyes. He had underestimated me. He had thought I was the kind of woman who would cry, scream, perhaps pack my bags and leave. He hadn't expected me to stand my ground, to take control, to calmly dismantle the life he wanted to abandon while still clinging to its outward appearance. The power dynamic had shifted, dramatically and without warning. And he, the man who had held all the cards, suddenly found himself holding nothing but a plain ticket to a future that no longer included the comfortable, predictable home he was leaving behind. The quiet strength I had cultivated over years of compromise and resilience was finally being weaponized, not destructively, but strategically. It was time to start packing. The house felt different that night. It wasn't just the silence after he finally retreated to the study, presumably to make hushed phone calls or simply stare into space, trying to process the seismic shift that had occurred. It was the air itself, lighter somehow, less constrained. Like a held breath finally released. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the scene in the kitchen, his panicked face, my own unexpected composure. It was a strange sort of calm, not peace, but the quiet focus of a general surveying the battlefield before the fight begins. Lying in the bed we had shared for so long, in the room that held countless memories, both good and painfully neutral, I felt a profound sense of detachment. The life we had built together no longer felt like ours. It felt like his construction, one I had merely inhabited, decorating it with my love and effort while he planned alternative blueprints. The next morning, I rose with the sun, a sense of purpose overriding the exhaustion. There was no breakfast together, no strained small talk. He stayed holed up in the study, the door firmly shut, a physical barrier reflecting the emotional one that had been erected between us. I went about my usual routine, making coffee, letting the dog out, watering the plants. These mundane tasks felt grounding, a connection to the reality I was choosing to preserve and protect. And then I went upstairs, to the closet we shared, a space that was a microcosm of our intertwined lives. His side was meticulously organized, a reflection of his need for control in at least one area of his life. My side was lived in. Piles of clothes waiting to be folded, shoes spilling slightly from their racks, a chaotic comfort that spoke of a life less concerned with perfect order and more with simply getting through the day. I opened his dresser drawers first. The neatly folded piles of t-shirts, socks, underwear. Each item felt heavy with history, a tangible link to moments now tainted. This plain white t-shirt he wore on our first camping trip. These socks, the ones he'd claimed were lucky for job interviews. The crisp business shirts, lined up like soldiers, silent witnesses to countless mornings he'd dressed for a world that seemed separate from mine. As I lifted each piece, I didn't just see fabric, I saw memories, overlaid with the searing knowledge of his betrayal. It was like flipping through a photo album where every picture was now subtly, sickeningly distorted. I folded them carefully, methodically, placing them into the suitcases I had retrieved from the attic. Suitcases we had used together for family vacations, for weekend getaways that now felt like relics of a different, perhaps imagined life. The irony was not lost on me. Using the vessels of our shared travels to facilitate his solo departure with another woman. It was slow work, physically and emotionally draining. Each garment was a tiny thread unraveling the tapestry of our marriage. I packed his everyday clothes first, the practical, unexciting things. The jeans, the jumpers, the casual shirts. They filled one suitcase quickly. As I moved on to the next, the more significant items began to appear. The suit he wore to our daughter's wedding. The blazer from our anniversary dinner last year. The silk tie I had given him for his birthday. These pieces carried more weight, more emotional baggage. I hesitated over the suit for a moment, the fabric cool against my fingers. I remembered watching him that day, so proud, so happy, surrounded by our family. Had he already started planning his exit then? Or had the seeds of discontent been sown so subtly, so long ago, that neither of us had noticed until it was too late? The thought brought a fresh wave of pain, sharp and unexpected. But I pushed it down. This wasn't the time for grief, or for trying to understand the incomprehensible motivations of a man who had clearly stopped seeing me long ago. This was the time for action. I continued packing, my movements precise and deliberate. I wasn't just clearing out a closet, I was dismantling a life. His life, as it was intertwined with mine. I came across a small box tucked away on a shelf. Inside were old letters, photographs, mementos. A faded picture of us from our early days, smiling, naive, full of hope. My younger self stared back at me, a painful reminder of the woman I was before the compromises, before the quiet disappointments accumulated into a mountain of unspoken grievances. I almost put it in the suitcase, a final, ironic conclusion. But then I stopped. Why should I give him the comfort of these shared memories? These were mine too. More mine, perhaps, because I was the one left holding the pieces. I closed the box and placed it on the shelf, away from the packing. Some things weren't leaving with him. The second suitcase was getting full. I moved on to shoes, toiletries, personal items from the bathroom. His toothbrush, his shaving kit, the cologne I used to buy him. Each item was another small cut. This wasn't the dramatic scene you see in movies, the angry spouse throwing things out the window. It was quiet, methodical, almost clinical. And, in its own way, that felt more powerful. It wasn't an act of rage. It was an act of separation. A clear declaration that I was detaching myself, physically and emotionally, from his life and his choices. He had made his bed, or rather, booked his villa. Now he had to lie in it. Alone. Well, not entirely alone. I reminded myself, the bitter taste of the itinerary returning. He would have her. The woman he deemed worthy of 2 weeks in paradise, while I was deemed worthy of deception and dismissal. The thought fueled my resolve. As I folded his clothes, I found myself thinking about the years. The compromises I had made, the dreams I had quietly set aside to support his career, to build a stable home for our blended family. The times I had bitten my tongue, ignored my intuition, smoothed over awkward family dynamics involving his ex and their children. I had done it out of love, yes, but also out of a deep-seated belief in the sanctity of the commitment we had made. I believed in the life we were building, even when it felt unbalanced, even when I felt invisible. This betrayal wasn't just about a vacation. It was about the fundamental disrespect it represented for every sacrifice I had made, every ounce of emotional labor I had invested in our marriage. It was a repudiation of me, and I couldn't stay in a place where I was so fundamentally undervalued. I finished packing the second suitcase, zipping it closed with a sense of finality. 2 large suitcases, neatly packed with the material remnants of his life here. It felt insufficient somehow, such a small collection of objects to represent the ending of 2 decades. But it wasn't about the things, it was about the message. And the message was clear. He had chosen his path, and that path led away from me. I stacked the suitcases by the bedroom door, tangible symbols of the line I was drawing. They stood there, silent and imposing, waiting for their owner. I looked around the bedroom, at the space that felt both intimately familiar and suddenly foreign. It would take time to make it mine again, to erase the phantom presence of his side of the bed, his clothes in the closet, his scent in the air. But for the first time in a long time, the future felt less like a continuation of a narrative written by someone else, and more like a blank page waiting for my own hand to begin writing. The packing continued over the next day, a methodical dismantling of a shared existence. I moved from the bedroom to the study, the room where he spent hours, the door often closed, a physical manifestation of the secrets he kept. This was where the itinerary had likely been booked, the clandestine arrangements made. Packing his things here felt like an act of purging, cleansing the space of his deceit. I boxed up his books, his files, his endless collection of pens he was so particular about. His desk was a jumble of half-finished projects, crumpled notes, and technology one barely understood. It was a reflection of his mind, I thought. Busy, scattered, always focused outwards, rarely inwards, and certainly not on the quiet life we shared within these walls. As I handled his possessions, memories surfaced unbidden. Arguments we'd had in this room, late-night conversations, the rare moments of intimacy that now felt painfully fragile in retrospect. Each object was a trigger, but instead of succumbing to sorrow, I felt a hardening resolve. This separation was necessary, not just for my peace of mind, but for my very survival. I couldn't continue to live a lie, orbiting a man who preferred the company of his past. I found more photos as I packed, pictures of him with his ex-wife, tucked away in drawers, easily overlooked. They weren't prominently displayed, of course. That would have been too obvious. But their presence, hidden but not discarded, spoke volumes. They were relics he couldn't bring himself to fully let go of, constantly lurking in the background of our life. Seeing them now didn't ignite jealousy as it might have years ago. It confirmed what I had suspected, that a part of him had always remained connected to her, a tether I could never truly sever, no matter how hard I tried to build a new reality with him. I placed the photos back in the drawer, not bothering to pack them. They belonged to his past, a past he was clearly more interested in revisiting than building a future with me. Let him take those memories with him if he wanted to. I was done competing with ghosts. The house itself began to feel like a character in this unfolding drama. Not just a setting, but a silent observer, a repository of layered histories. The walls held echoes of our laughter, our arguments, the quiet moments of everyday life. Now, as I systematically removed his belongings, it felt like the house was exhaling, shedding the weight of a strained coexistence. I thought about the garden, the one I had poured so much effort into, creating a sanctuary of beauty and peace. He rarely noticed the new blooms, the changing colors of the leaves. His world was elsewhere, in the bustling city, on golf courses, and, as it turned out, planning lavish trips to France. The contrast between my focus on nurturing the tangible, the life within these walls and this garden, and his constant seeking of something external, something seemingly more exciting, was stark. It highlighted how fundamentally different we had become, or perhaps always were beneath the surface. Packing his golf clubs felt particularly symbolic. The hours spent on the greens, the camaraderie with his friends, another world I was only occasionally invited into. These clubs represented a freedom I rarely experienced, tied as I was to the responsibilities of home and family. As I carefully placed them in their travel bag, ready to be loaded into the car, I felt a strange sense of liberation myself. His hobbies, his interests, his separate life, they were all being gathered up, packaged, and prepared for departure. It was more than just packing. It was drawing a boundary, reclaiming my space, both physical and emotional. This house, which had felt like our house, was slowly but surely becoming my house again. The thought was both daunting and exhilarating. Could I manage it all on my own? The finances, the maintenance, the sheer emptiness of living alone after so many years of shared habitation? The fear was there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was tempered by a rising tide of determination. I had been quietly strong for so long. It was time to be overtly strong. I reached out to a lawyer, a discreet call made from my car while parked miles away from the house. It was a necessary step, a practical action in the face of emotional chaos. The conversation was calm, informative, grounding. It laid out the legal landscape, the steps I needed to take to protect myself and secure my future. This wasn't just about his departure. It was about formally dissolving a partnership that had become untenable. The lawyer's calm, professional demeanor was a stark contrast to the turmoil within me, but it provided a framework, a path forward. It wasn't revenge I sought, not in the petty sense. It was justice. Justice for the years of feeling invisible, for the quiet sacrifices, for the ultimate disrespect shown by his actions. Packing his bags was the emotional declaration. The legal process was the formalization of that declaration. As I moved through the house, gathering his belongings, I noticed things I hadn't paid attention to in years. A painting he'd bought early in our marriage, an impulse purchase I'd never particularly liked. A worn armchair where he always sat to read the paper. Small, insignificant items that were woven into the fabric of our daily lives. I made decisions about each item. Was it his to take? Was it something I wanted gone? Was it something that held a memory worth keeping, even if the memory was now tinged with sadness? It was a process of sifting through not just possessions, but through the layers of our shared history, deciding what to keep, what to discard, and what to return to its rightful, albeit now separated, owner. The house was becoming a space of reckoning, a physical manifestation of the emotional and relational accounting that was long overdue. The two large suitcases stood by the door, joined now by several boxes filled with books, files, and miscellaneous items. They were silent sentinels, awaiting his command. He had remained in the study for most of the day, emerging only to make coffee or use the bathroom, avoiding eye contact, the air around him thick with unspoken tension. He hadn't challenged me, hadn't tried to stop the packing. Perhaps he was in shock, perhaps he knew, deep down, that I was justified. Or perhaps he was simply waiting for me to break, to collapse in tears and tell him I didn't mean it. But I wouldn't. The quiet strength I had always possessed was no longer quiet. It was active, decisive, and unwavering. I wasn't just packing his bags. I was unpacking myself from a life that had become a cage of his making. And the key to that cage was the itinerary he had carelessly left on the kitchen counter. The south of France beckoned him, but my future beckoned me, a future free from the shadow of his past and the weight of his deception. The house was almost ready to be mine again. The air in the house grew thicker with anticipation as the day progressed. The packed bags stood sentinel by the door, a silent testament to the irreversible steps that had been taken. He emerged from the study eventually, his face etched with fatigue and something that might have been fear. He saw the bags, the boxes, and his shoulders sagged slightly. There was no outburst, no dramatic scene. Just a quiet, defeated acknowledgement of the new reality. He didn't look at me directly, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder. "You're serious," he stated, the obvious question hanging unanswered in the air. "Did you think I wasn't?" I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't coldness, but a protective shield against the resurfacing pain. Years of being dismissed, of having my feelings minimized, had taught me to guard my vulnerability. He ran a hand over one of the suitcases, as if trying to grasp the tangible reality of his situation. "This is extreme," he muttered, shaking his head. "Extreme?" Booking a secret romantic getaway with his ex-wife was apparently not extreme, but packing his bags in response was. The irony was sharp, almost unbearable. "Is it?" I challenged softly. More extreme than planning a life-altering trip with another woman behind my back? More extreme than the years of subtle neglect, of making me feel like a placeholder? This, I gesture to the bags, is simply the logical consequence of your actions. You chose your path. I'm just helping you walk it. He finally looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something. Regret? Doubt? He found neither. Only a quiet certainty that unnerved him. Where am I supposed to go? He asked, the helplessness in his voice feeling utterly performative after the calculated deception he had engaged in. That, I said, is entirely up to you. Perhaps the villa in the south of France is available for an early check-in? The bitterness in my voice was unintentional, a small crack in my composure. He flinched. She doesn't know about this, he said, perhaps hoping to salvage some part of his carefully constructed deceit, or perhaps genuinely concerned about the fallout on that side of his life. I imagine you'll be explaining a lot of things to a lot of people very soon, I replied flatly. His world was about to unravel, and while a part of me felt a grim satisfaction, the larger part simply felt weary. Weary of the drama, weary of the lies, weary of him. He started making calls then, hushed, urgent conversations in the study, the doors still closed but the raised voices filtering through. I heard fragments, mentions of travel plans, unexpected changes, logistics. He was scrambling, trying to manage the fallout, perhaps trying to find somewhere to stay, trying to explain to his travel companion why their romantic getaway was suddenly preceded by a less-than-romantic eviction from his home. The tension in the house was a palpable thing, a heavy weight settling over everything. I moved through the rooms, performing small tasks, tidying, cleaning, creating a sense of order in the midst of chaos. It was a way of reclaiming the space, asserting my presence, making it clear that this was still my home, and he was now the intruder, albeit a temporary one. His son called, his voice sharp with accusation. What's going on? Dad says you're kicking him out. Accusation, not concern for my well-being. It was typical. His children had always seen me as the obstacle, the woman who wasn't their mother, the one who had somehow disrupted their family unit, even though their parents had been divorced for years before I met him. They rarely saw his flaws, his manipulations. He was their father, and in their eyes, I was the outsider. Your father made some choices, I explained calmly, carefully. Choices that make it impossible for us to live together anymore. What choices? He demanded. He says it's just a business trip. The lie, reinforced by his father, stung. It wasn't just him I had to contend with, but the narrative he was spinning to everyone around us. It wasn't a business trip, I stated, my voice firm. It was a vacation. A romantic vacation. For him and his ex-wife. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. He didn't challenge it. Perhaps, deep down, he knew his father was capable of this. Or perhaps he was just stunned. He finally emerged from the study, keys in hand, a small overnight bag slung over his shoulder. The suitcases were too much to handle immediately, I supposed. He looked smaller somehow, the carefully constructed facade of the successful, in-control man having completely crumbled. He avoided my gaze. I'm going to a hotel, he mumbled. We'll talk. There's nothing left to talk about, I said, my voice steady. You made your intentions clear when you booked that trip. Now I'm making mine clear. The bags will be ready when you arrange to collect them. He hesitated by the door, perhaps expecting a different reaction, a plea, tears, a change of heart. He got none of it. Only a quiet, resolute woman standing her ground in the home he had chosen to abandon. He opened the door and stepped out, the warm evening air rushing in. He didn't look back. The door closed with a soft click, a tiny sound that marked the end of an era. The silence that descended was profound, absolute. He was gone. Just like that. After 20 years, he was gone, leaving behind his packed bags, his secrets, and the echoes of a life that was no longer ours. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, the silence pressing in on me. It wasn't just the absence of his physical presence, it was the absence of the constant, underlying tension that had permeated our life for years. It was a vacuum, but one that felt full of potential. I walked back into the living room and sat on the sofa, the itinerary envelope still on the coffee table. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. This piece of paper, this seemingly innocent travel document, had been the catalyst for such a dramatic upheaval. It was a symbol of his betrayal, yes, but also a symbol of my liberation. He had intended it as an escape route for himself and his ex-wife. It had become my escape route from a life of quiet desperation. The feeling was bittersweet, a complex mixture of pain, relief, sadness, and a growing sense of empowerment. The betrayal hurt deeply, a wound that would take time to heal. The sadness for the lost years, the broken promises, was a heavy weight in my chest. But beneath it all, a new feeling was stirring, a sense of possibility. The house felt vast and empty without him, the space he occupied now a silent void. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet. The kitchen, where I'd discovered the itinerary. The bedroom, where I'd systematically packed away his life. The study, now empty of his immediate presence, ready to be repurposed. Each room held memories, but they were no longer memories of us. They were memories of me, navigating my life alongside him, often feeling alone even when he was present. Now, at least the aloneness was honest. It wasn't the quiet solitude of a woman living with a stranger. It was the bracing solitude of a woman standing on her own 2 feet, ready to face the future on her own terms. I opened the back door and stepped out into the garden. The air was cool and soft, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine. The garden, my sanctuary, felt welcoming, familiar. It was a place of growth, of resilience, a testament to the patient nurturing I had provided. Unlike the house, which had been built and shaped by both of us, the garden was truly mine. It reflected my efforts, my vision, my connection to the earth. Standing there, surrounded by the results of my labor, I felt grounded, centered. This was real. This was mine. And I would nurture it, just as I would now nurture myself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be practical challenges, legal hurdles, emotional fallout. His children would likely be angry, perhaps resentful. Our mutual friends would take sides, or offer awkward condolences. The south of France trip, I knew, would likely still happen, albeit under strange circumstances. That thought still pricked, a tiny, annoying reminder of the woman he had chosen over me. But it no longer held the power to devastate. It was his choice, his consequence to live with. My focus was no longer on him, or on her, or on the past they represented. My focus was on me, on rebuilding, on redefining, on rediscovering the woman I was before the compromises, before the quiet strength became a necessity. I looked back at the house, its windows dark and silent. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol of my resilience, of my refusal to be a victim. I had taken the blueprint of his betrayal and transformed it into the key to my freedom. He had booked a vacation for his ex. I had packed his bags for a journey he hadn't intended, a journey that led him out of my life and allowed me to finally step fully into my own. The quiet strength I had always possessed was no longer just a means of survival. It was the foundation upon which I would build my new life. It was bittersweet, yes, the ending of a long chapter filled with both love and pain. But it was also redemptive. I had faced the betrayal head-on, taken decisive action, and reclaimed my agency. The future stretched before me, uncertain but mine. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like the most beautiful destination of all. The packed bags by the door were not a monument to failure, but markers on the path to a hard-won freedom.